What time frame are we talking about?
Well, the grand vision, a trillion humans in the solar system and so on. That's hundreds of years. But we can have in just a couple of decades, I think we can have much lower cost space travel, and then we can start to have really a dynamic entrepreneurial explosion in space. You can't really have much entrepreneurial activity in space today because just the basic price of admission is too expensive. Just to do anything, even something relatively small in space, is still very, very expensive. We need to lower the cost of admission so that thousands of entrepreneurs can have companies in space, kind of like what we've seen on the internet. Right now, you can't be two kids in a dorm room can make Facebook, but they can't make a space company. It's not practical. I want to make that practical.
Gotcha. So, that leads me to think about some of the conversations we've had. This is another view of those mountains in West Texas. Sitting around that fire pit, and some of the most profound conversations, for me anyway, that we've had are around the topic of long-term thinking.
Yeah.
Which is something that you've really embraced, and you've brought to the businesses that you run.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit of I don't think that most people who are running businesses or who are even starting a company like Blue Origin allow themselves to think in centuries, even for visions, for a vision of what they're creating. Or at Amazon, I know that you've said 5 to 7 year timeframes for experiments that you're running. Talk to me about long-term thinking and your point of view on.
Well, long-term thinking is a lever. It lets you do things that you could not do or couldn't even conceive of doing if you were thinking short-term. So if that's why, I have a project where I'm helping a group of people build a 10,000-year clock. It kind of ticks once a year and dongs once a century, and the cuckoo comes out once a millennium. It's a big 500-foot tall thing inside a mountain right here.
Inside one of those mountains.
In this mountain range. And the 10,000-year clock is a symbol. I don't think it'll do anything for the first few hundred years. But after a few hundred years, once it's old, people start to pay attention to older symbols. And so a few hundred years from now, I hope that people will think about that as a symbol for long-term thinking. If I collaborated with somebody here in this audience and I said, look, I want you to solve world hunger, and I want you to do it in 5 years, you would properly reject the opportunity. You would say, look, it's not possible, it's not practical. But if I said, look, I want you to solve world hunger in 100 years, that's a job you'd take because it's a much more addressable problem. You can first create the conditions. You have time to create the conditions where then you can solve the problem. And so that's a very important way of thinking, and I find it works with everything. You have to back up and find the right time horizon for what you're trying to do. But at Amazon, we probably do most of our things. We expect to get some results in sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But we find a lot of our other companies that compete against us in various ways, they're often trying to get things done in 2 or 3 years. And so we can do things that if everything has to work in 2 to 3 years, then that limits what you can do. If you give yourself the breathing room to say, okay, I'm okay if it takes 7 years, all of a sudden you have way more opportunities.